They say optimism is a choice, a mental switch you flip when things get hard. But somewhere in a hospital room, a person facing their third surgery still smiles at the nurse. In a failing business, an entrepreneur sees not collapse, but recalibration. While logic screams surrender, something deeper whispers, not yet. This video is about them, the ones whose minds bend toward light, even in darkness, the ones who don't deny reality, but refuse to be defined by it. And the question we rarely ask, what makes their brains work this way? Optimism isn't naivety. It's not pretending everything is fine when it's falling apart. True optimism is a cognitive architecture, a way the brain processes uncertainty, threat, and possibility. Neuroscientists have discovered that optimistic people don't see a different world. They see the same world through a different lens. Their anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region that detects conflict and error, shows reduced reactivity to negative stimuli. Meanwhile, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which governs emotional regulation and reward anticipation, lights up more intensely when imagining positive futures. In other words, optimistic minds aren't blind to darkness. They're simply better at metabolizing it into fuel. This isn't luck. It's neural wiring shaped by experience, belief, and choice. And once you understand how it works, you realize optimism isn't about ignoring pain. It's about refusing to let pain be the only story. At the heart of optimism lies a powerful cognitive bias called the optimism bias, the tendency to believe good things are more likely to happen than bad ones. Studies show that approximately 80% of humans carry this bias to some degree. It's not delusion, it's survival. Our ancestors who believed tomorrow might bring better hunting grounds were more likely to keep moving, keep trying, keep living. Pessimism may protect you from disappointment, but optimism protects you from paralysis. Optimistic minds don't filter out risk, they reframe it. Where others see failure, they see feedback. Where others see endings, they see intervals. Psychologist Martin Seligman called this explanatory style how we explain events to ourselves. Pessimists internalize failure as permanent, personal, and pervasive. I failed because I'm not good enough, and I'll always fail. Optimists externalize it as temporary, specific, and changeable. I failed this time because of these factors, and I can adjust. Same event, different narrative. And that narrative shapes everything: emotions, decisions, resilience, even lifespan. Here's where it gets fascinating. Optimistic people aren't always happier in the moment. In fact, they often feel disappointment more intensely because they expect more. But they recover faster. Their brains don't ruminate on loss, they redirect toward possibility. Neurologically, this is linked to higher levels of dopamine sensitivity in the reward pathways. When an optimistic person imagines a positive outcome, their brain releases dopamine not just when the goal is achieved, but during the anticipation. Hope itself becomes the reward. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. The more they hope, the more their brain rewards them for hoping, and the more resilient they become in the face of setback. Pessimists call this dangerous. Optimists call it living. Optimism isn't passive, it's active interpretation. The Stoics understood this centuries before neuroscience. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That's the optimistic mind in ancient language. Obstacles aren't roadblocks, they're redirection. Optimistic people don't believe everything will work out, they believe they can work with whatever comes. That's a crucial distinction. It's not faith in outcomes, it's faith in adaptability. When life breaks their plan, they don't break, they rebuild with the pieces. This cognitive flexibility is what separates resilient optimism from toxic positivity. Toxic positivity denies reality. Resilient optimism accepts it and asks, now what? It doesn't say everything happens for a reason. It says, I will find a reason to keep going. That shift from passive acceptance to active agency is the psychological core of the optimistic mind. But optimism also carries a shadow. The same brain that imagines brighter futures can underestimate real danger. Studies show optimists are more likely to take financial risks, ignore health warnings, and overestimate their control over outcomes. This is why some optimists crash harder than pessimists. They leap without looking. They trust without verifying. Their belief in possibility blinds them to probability. Yet even here, there's nuance. The most effective optimists aren't reckless dreamers. They're strategic hopers. They combine optimism with preparation. They expect the best, but plan for the worst. This hybrid mindset, sometimes called realistic optimism or flexible optimism, may be the most adaptive psychological stance a human can adopt. It's not about denying risk, it's about not being paralyzed by it. Here's what's rarely discussed. Optimism is socially contagious. When an optimistic person enters a room, the emotional temperature shifts. Their presence doesn't just affect mood, it affects decision making. Research shows that groups led by optimistic individuals take more creative risks, collaborate more openly, and recover from failure faster. Why? Because optimism lowers the psychological cost of trying. It reduces the fear of judgment. It creates permission to imagine beyond constraint. Pessimists protect the group from danger. Optimists push the group toward growth. Both are necessary. But in a world already saturated with fear, optimism becomes the rarer, more valuable resource. And optimistic people, often without realizing it, become emotional anchors for everyone around them. Their belief becomes borrowed courage for those who've lost their own. Yet optimism is not equally accessible. Trauma, chronic stress, and systemic oppression can erode the brain's capacity for hope. The optimism bias weakens in people who've been repeatedly disappointed. Their anterior cingulate cortex becomes hypervigilant. Their amygdala stays on high alert. Hope starts to feel dangerous, a setup for pain. For them, pessimism isn't negativity, it's self protection. That's why telling someone to just be positive is not only useless, it's cruel. Optimism isn't a moral virtue, it's a neurological privilege shaped by safety, stability, and the luxury of second chances. To rebuild optimism after loss requires more than mindset. It requires environment, support, and time. The brain must relearn that effort leads to reward, that pain isn't permanent, that the future is not a repetition of the past. This is why therapy, community, and small wins matter. They rewire the predictive machinery of the mind. So, what sustains an optimistic mind in the long term? It's not ignorance, it's purpose. Viktor Frankl, surviving the horrors of Auschwitz, observed that those who survived longest weren't the strongest or smartest. They were the ones who held on to meaning, a reason to endure beyond today. Optimism without purpose is fragile. It collapses under weight. But optimism tethered to purpose becomes unshakable because it's no longer about whether things will be easy, it's about whether they'll be worth it. Optimistic people don't need guarantees, they need direction. And that direction, even if uncertain, is enough to keep moving forward. Here's the paradox. Optimistic minds see the world more clearly than pessimists think. They're not delusional, they're deliberate. They choose which story to tell about what they see. And in that choice lies their power. Because reality is never just one thing. It's layered, contradictory, unfinished. The pessimist locks onto the darkest layer and calls it truth. The optimist scans the entire landscape and asks, where's the light? Both are responding to the same data, but only one is building a life they want to live. In the end, optimism is not about being right, it's about being alive. It's the refusal to let fear write the final chapter. It's the quiet rebellion of hope in a world built on cynicism. And maybe that's what the optimistic mind really understands, that despair is easy, that surrender is always an option. But so is one more step, one more try, one more tomorrow. And in a universe indifferent to our suffering, choosing to believe in better is the most radically human thing we can do. So, to the people with optimistic minds, you are not naive. You are architects of possibility in a world obsessed with limits. While others retreat into certainty, you lean into mystery. And in that lean, you create space for the rest of us to breathe, to hope, to try again. Because sometimes the bravest thing a mind can do is not to protect itself from disappointment, but to stay open to wonder anyway.